Show. I want to thank everyone for tuning in to the 25th Hour radio show today here on Monster Radio AM 1150. I am your host, Rob Fairless, and on the phone with me today is retired United States Marine Corps Major General, former astronaut, and the 12th Administrator of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, Mr. Charles Bolden, Jr. Mr. Bolden, thank you for taking time out of your day to join me on the show.
Oh, it's a pleasure being with you. I'm glad you asked me to come on.
Now, Mr. Bolden, it's tradition on the show. I take a trip back in time on my first question and get a little background information about my guest for the listeners out there. Let's start with your military career. What was the motivating factor for you to join the military, and how did that lead you into becoming a Marine aviator?
Well, Rob, I grew up in Columbia, South Carolina. My dad, though college educated, had been drafted in the Army in 1940 and went overseas and came home when the war ended, but never talked very much about his war experiences. But nonetheless, I could look at the pictures having served. I think instilled in me was not only a desire but a commitment to serve somehow, and it took quite some time and a few battles with my congressional delegation where I couldn't get an appointment out of South Carolina. But I finally got to the Naval Academy intending to be a frogman, what is now the modern-day SEAL, only to find out that at that time that was a restricted line area, so I couldn't do that, and I had to decide what else I wanted to do. And over time, I decided that I wanted to be like my very first company officer, my plebe year at the Naval Academy, which was to become a Marine Corps infantry officer. That kind of went away when I was going through the basic school, and my wife convinced me we should go to Pensacola. So that's how I became a Marine and how I ended up in aviation.
Now, as a pilot for the Marine Corps, how many different types of aircraft were you able to get behind the wheel of, so to speak? And did you have your own personal favorite that you enjoyed flying more than others?
My personal favorite is the A6 Intruder, which was my first fleet airplane. I began to fly that coming right out of the training command, went to the Fleet Replacement Squadron in Cherry Point, North Carolina for A6s, and that's the airplane I flew in Vietnam. After becoming a test pilot and then other things, I've flown in excess of 30, maybe 40 varieties of aircraft, some more than others. The ones that I have the most time in, though, are the A6 Intruder, the F-18 Hornet, and then CH-46 and UH-1 helicopter. And the T-38, I forgot about the T-38. I have a couple of thousand hours in the T-38, which was our proficiency flying airplane while I was in the astronaut office for 14 years.
So becoming a pilot for our military is very prestigious on its own, but you took that a step further by submitting your application to become a part of the space program for NASA. Now, in your experience, is that a goal for a lot of our military aviators out there to become a part of the space program?
I think a significant number of young men and women who decide that they want to be military pilots have a desire somewhere down the road of becoming test pilots and then getting into the astronaut office. I'm not sure, what the percentage is, but I would say a lot of people that I talk to tend to be motivated by that long-term goal.
Now, was becoming an astronaut a personal goal of yours in the very beginning? Or?
Never. Even when I went to flight school just because I didn't want to crawl around in the mud. I didn't have any burning desire to be an aviator, but my wife thought it would be a good idea to go there. I fell in love with flying when I went to Pensacola and started flight training. And then one of my instructor pilots, before I got my wings, was a Marine Corps test pilot. We talked about the experience and talked about the challenge. And so in the back of my head, I began to think that someday I wanted to be a test pilot. And, when I came back from Vietnam, I started applying and many applications. I was finally accepted by the Marine Corps to go to test pilot school, went to Patuxent River, Maryland, which is the Navy's test pilot school in the Naval Air Test Center. And it was there after becoming a test pilot that I had an opportunity to meet a young man by the name of Dr. Ron McNair. He and I had both grown up about 42 miles from each other in South Carolina. He in Lake City and me in Columbia. We did not know each other, but our backgrounds were similar. He was African-American just as me. His mother was a teacher. My mom and dad were teachers. And, Ron had lived his entire life wanting to be an astronaut, attained his goal. And we talked over the weekend. I was infatuated. I was mesmerized by what he said he was doing as an astronaut candidate. And so when he got ready to leave on Sunday afternoon, one of his last questions to me was, "Hey, are you going to apply for the program?" I said, "Not on your life." And he looked at me real strange because that I had been excited and I was going to apply, and I said, "Well, they'd never pick me." And he said, "That's the dumbest thing I ever heard." He said, "How do you know if you don't apply?" And so he kind of embarrassed me, for one thing, because my mom and dad had told me all my life that I could do anything I wanted to do if I was willing to work for it. So when he left, I went home, picked up pen, and got an application and applied, and the Marine Corps nominated me to NASA, and I got an opportunity to be invited down to Houston to interview, and I was selected in the second group of space shuttle astronauts.
So how long had you been part of the program before you were chosen for your first mission, and what was that mission?
Well, I was. My class started in the summer of 1980, and I was named to my first crew in late 83, early 84. We were the flight immediately before Challenger. We landed, and 10 days later we lost Challenger. And that mission was on the shuttle Columbia, and it was, we affectionately called it the end of the year clearance mission, because we had a communication satellite and a number of materials out in the payload bay and in the cabin that a lot of the investigators had been waiting years to fly. So we had sort of a hodgepodge of experiments on board with us.
Now, Mr. Bolden, would you please indulge me on this? From your perspective, from the moment, the countdown begins up until the moment you view our planet from a vantage point, very few individuals in the history of mankind have. What went through your mind the first time you left our planet Earth?
Well, you crawl into the vehicle several hours before flight. For the most part, because you've trained, we had actually been training for a couple of years before we flew. And I actually considered an advantage. One of the other advantages that we had was that our crew had actually crawled into the vehicle 4 times prior to this time with the intent of flying. We scrubbed four times, not to mention the number of times that we never even got out to the vehicle. So we had been through a number of months of getting into the vehicle, climbing out, getting back into the vehicle, climbing out. So on the day that we launched on January 12th, 1986, it was a beautiful morning, but we went to the vehicle fully expecting that we probably wouldn't go again, that something might happen. And when we came out of the final hole, what we call the T-minus 9-minute hole, when they pick up the count again, we all scrambled because we had kind of relaxed, and a couple of crew members had unstrapped, and so we had to get all strapped back in and get ready to go fly. And so when we launched, it was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. I was thoroughly prepared. I was a little bit apprehensive because I knew there was a lot of things that could go wrong, and because that's what your training is. Your training is all disaster training, and you only get to see one successful ascent, one successful launch where you go to space and nothing happens, and that's the week before you go down to the Kennedy Space Center, and they give you an opportunity to see one normal entry so that you know what they look like, because that's generally what happens on a flight. They're all highly successful with very few things going on, with the exception of the 2 vehicles we lost. But, kind of to get me over any nervousness I may have had, we had an alarm go off immediately after liftoff, which was a indication of a helium problem, losing helium from one of our main engines, which on its getting ready to lose a main engine, which means we're going to have to do something that had never been done before, called a return to launch site abort, or cause the vehicle to flip around, fly back through its own flames for a while until it headed back to the Cape and then come back to Kennedy Space Center and land. Over the process of working the emergency procedure, though, we determined and determined that we had a sensor problem, a real problem. So we notified the ground that we thought everything was okay. We reconfigured to normal and went on to space. So, and the rest of the flight was pretty uneventful with some minor things that went wrong. But after starting it out that way, there wasn't a lot more that could have made it, could have gotten your heart beating anymore. So I was mesmerized within the first 15 minutes, looking out the window, and I remember preparing for years to view the planet and the continent of my ancestry the African continent. I had done a lot of study of African geography so that I'd be able to tell where all the countries were. And when I looked out the window about, roughly 10 minutes into flight, we were about to go over the continent of Africa, which to me looked like a small island, or a big island, actually, out the window. And I started to weep a little bit, and I was overcome with some disappointment because in all my study, it just looked like one big landmass. There were no lines. There was no demarcation between countries. I couldn't tell Nigeria from Ghana. No way to distinguish differences in countries or anything. It was just one big, beautiful continent out in front of us. And so that was my first true realization that, we live on one planet with one ocean in which we have these little bodies of land that stick up. And that anything that affects one of us affects all of us. And that other than the fact that we have different color skin and we speak different languages, we're all the same. And so that stuck with me, and it kind of guided me through the rest of my time in the space program and up until now.
Now, is the feeling the same the second, third, and fourth times? I mean, I can hardly imagine doing something like that becoming old hat. You know what I mean?
Every single time you launch and go to space is, other than the fact that you now have a lot more experience and so you know what to expect, but other than that, it's every single time is uniquely, there's something, you feel something different. It is almost like you've never been there before, except you find it much easier, to get into the routine, to adapt, to do everything else. But it's still breathtaking every time.
Now, do you have a personal favorite mission you were a part of out of the four you were a part of?
I don't. I have favorite parts of every one of my four missions. It goes without saying that my first mission was incredible because it was my first. And one of my crew members was now Senator Bill Nelson from Florida. So that was very special, having an opportunity to fly with a member of Congress, him understand, what we were going through and watch him train with us and become a real live astronaut. My second flight, we deployed the Hubble Space Telescope. So historically, that one is very special. My third flight was NASA's first mission to planet Earth, and it was also my first time commander for a flight, so having a crew for whom I was responsible. But my last flight, my fourth and final flight, I was the commander, and it was the first joint Russian-American mission, for which we brought 2 Russian cosmonauts and their families to the United States to train, and they lived here for about 2 years, training and living around us and with us. We became dear friends to this day, and the whole experience of that flight, from beginning to, meaning from the time they came to the U.S. until the time we landed, went to Russia for our post-flight, and the rest, that one was very special. But I wouldn't say it was more special than the other. I do say it probably affected me more and re-emphasized my belief in the fact that we're all basically the same people with the same objectives of trying to make Earth better for everybody and trying to find ways to live in harmony. So a little bit of specialty in all of them.
Now, did you ever get a chance to spacewalk?
I did not. I was a pilot, and so in the days of the space shuttle, prior to the space station, pilots were prohibited from doing spacewalks because, usually there were only 2 of you in the vehicle, along with and there was always a slight risk with spacewalks, and so we didn't want to leave the vehicle without a full complement of 2 pilots, so we weren't allowed to do spacewalks. I never even got into a real space suit, an EVA suit.
Well, being a pilot and a commander, I think you did pretty good for yourself.
That was okay.
Yeah. So let's move forward to your appointment as the administrator of NASA. Now, for people out there listening, and myself included, who's kind of out of the loop on how that works, is that something you were specifically singled out for by the president himself? I mean, how does a person land that position?
Like any president, like President Trump had, they have a transition team, and each agency has a sub-team to that transition team that goes out and searches for people that they think. They looked for a NASA administrator for about 6 months of the first 6 months of the Obama administration. I had an opportunity to go to Washington and talk with Dr. Holdren, and my guess is Dr. Holdren, working with the members of the transition team, probably made the recommendation to the president that he I went up and spent about 20 minutes talking to the president one day about NASA, but not about being the NASA administrator, just about the space program and his vision, wanting to get humans farther out into space than ever before, but to stay there and to inspire young men and women to want to study science and engineering and the like. And I went back home to Houston and didn't hear anything for several months. And then I got a call that said the president had decided he wanted to nominate me to be the next NASA administrator. And so I went to Washington for a couple of months off and on to do my my interviews and all my prep for my confirmation hearing before I went before the Senate Commerce Committee for confirmation. And I was interviewed. I had a hearing, and I was confirmed that same day, and I was sitting at my desk the next day.
Now, in your time as the administrator, and you might have answered this a little bit on your last statement there, did you have specific personal goals you wanted to achieve, or were you instructed to focus on certain tasks by the president?
The president gives you some broad range, at least President Obama did. The things that I knew he wanted, going back farther than the moon, going into deep space. The moon was fine, but he liked the idea of Mars. He wanted us to get ordinary people more involved in the space program than before. He wanted us to enhance our international outreach. He used to say, I guess the term he used was, he wanted us a number of non-traditional partners we had, and that involved going to places like Africa and the Middle East and even the Far East to see if we could get some of the smaller countries that had an interest in space but didn't have the complete wherewithal, either economically or technically. And so I'm very proud of the manner in which we reached out to non-traditional partners. When I left, we had formal partnership agreements, more than 800 of them with more than 120 countries. So that was something that he wanted us to do, and I thought we did a pretty good job of it.
Any regrets as your time as administrator?
No, I'm very satisfied with the work. I'm disappointed that we didn't get some things done that I thought we should have or could have had we been a little bit better in our relationship with Congress and gotten them to sign on and help us sooner. But I don't have any regrets. I can name a gazillion things that I think we should have done and could have done had we figured out how to work better with Congress, international partners. But all in all, I'm very happy.
So how are you spending your time now? Are you taking it easy, enjoying the good life, or are you still in the workforce?
I am relaxing and enjoying life and spending a lot more time with my 3 beautiful granddaughters who live out in Falls Church, with my son, who's a career Marine stationed at the Pentagon, doctor at Howard University Hospital up in town. So we have the entire Bolden family together for the first time since they were all in high school. I serve on 2 corporate boards, one private and one publicly traded. I have some engagement with a few philanthropic and boards, and my wife and I have reformed a small business, a limited liability company for consulting, and I consult in the areas of science and engineering, aeronautics and space, leadership, and international relations.
And before we wrap this up, Mr. Bolden, I'm going to get a ton of hate mail if I don't ask you this question.
You'll probably get hate mail no matter what. After this, one thing I will say about my interviews, although I think I do okay, inevitably they end up getting the host a bunch of hate mail.
It's just a simple question. What do you think about intelligent life outside of our own planet?
I am a firm believer in the fact that there is life elsewhere. What we're looking for, what we think is critically important, is to bring evidence that there is life in its most rudimentary form, and that means microbes, single-cell organisms. That's what we think we're going to find, for example, when we get to Mars, or what we're going to find somewhere like on a moon of Jupiter called Europa or Enceladus or one of the moons of Saturn. I am convinced that there is life elsewhere in our solar system, and that will help us understand the origin of life here on Earth. Every time we send a satellite or a rover or anything to another planet or another member of the solar system family of bodies, we learn more about our own planet Earth, and I think that's what's critically important. We need to understand, what we can do to damage it, what has been done to damage it already, how much of it can we reverse, at least how much can we stop, and because we want Earth to be the best it can be for all humanity.
Now, do you think we've been visited, or do you think all the UFO sightings and quote unquote evidence that we see on TV is nothing more than conjecture?
I'm not one who is a believer in. I have to be very careful here because some people will misunderstand this. We encounter UFOs all the time. A UFO, from the technical sense, is an unidentified flying object. UFOs that you sighted around the space shuttle were ice coming off the back of the vehicle, or a wrench or a screw or something that had been lost during a spacewalk. So UFOs from the technical perspective are not unusual. UFOs from the standpoint of another life form, while I don't know any more than anybody else, but I've seen any evidence that we've ever been visited by a UFO. By another life form.
I got you. I had to ask. And,
no. And I am one who says, however, just because I don't think so doesn't mean it's not so.
That's right. And one more thing real quick before we wrap things up. I also read somewhere on August 28, 2012, you were the first human being to have your voice broadcast on the surface of Mars. What did you say?
Well, it was way too long for me to repeat. I was asked this question on a program called Wait, Wait, Don't Tell on National Public Radio, and I don't have the slightest idea what I said. But I went back and looked it up, and it was like 2 minutes worth of it was a prepared set of remarks. But in essence, it said how happy we were to have Curiosity roaming the planet, and that we hope that this would demonstrate and promote unity among humanity, and that everybody would recognize that we did this for all humankind, hoping that others would follow.
Nothing like Charles Bolden in the house. Nothing like that, huh?
Spend some time with you. This has been great, and if the hate mail you get, just blame it on me.